So let's start with the first presentation that is by our very best fellows of the center. So Linda and Alan and Stylianos are going to talk about putting 110,000 examinations online. What have we learned? So the stage is yours, guys. And for the rest of us, we just have to learn what they have learned.
So we are talking about putting 110,000 examinations online, and really what have we learned? So we undertook a massive move to online assessment for our students, and we've already heard from some colleagues at one of the recognised teaching centres about the challenges that posed for students, and indeed challenges for all of us involved. So we're going to start with a little bit of background research on this. I'm going to hand over to Stylianos, if I may, to introduce some of the background research.
Let us start then our exploration of online assessment with some background research on online assessment. Much of it has been completed and reported prior to the rapid changes that the online teaching assessment generated by this pandemic. So I will start with some pre-COVID situation research, and then I will report on some of the recent debates that have been taking place during the pandemic. So research has indicated that most students are interested in going through an online assessment rather than a pencil one. This research reported by Marriott in 2009. More recent research has discussed student performance and claims that student performance does not have significant difference in final examination scores. What's the motivation from students when they go for online assessment, beyond being told by the institution that they have to take online assessment? So there is an increased speed and ease of editing responses that they really appreciate when they use an online platform instead of a pencil and the paper. The other thing that they seem to be motivated about, they're very appreciative of quicker feedback, and they consider as an important aspect of the learning process the receiving relevant and timely feedback. And this is very important in the context of online assessment. Let's talk as well, in relation to research, about some of the debates on the prerequisites to allow equity in online assessment. I will come back to that later on, but as we understand, these are very important. So research has identified, as we understand, the development of online assessment technology skills and digital competencies to allow access to networks and technology. As mentioned before, some of the research where it's contradictory in terms of examinations, explorations, claims that there's no significant difference in final examination scores between people that took an online assessment and people that wrote the exams by hand using a pencil and a paper. However, there is some research, some educators notice a drop in overall online performance in assessment when compared to paper-based test scores of their peers. Now, it's very interesting, despite the fact that, as you understand, because of the recent kind of developments, there's no much peer-reviewed research. It's useful to look at some of the debates and discussions that are taking place in the higher education sector about the impact of pandemic and the relationship to online assessment. So it seems that because of the pandemic, that online assessment almost became an established alternative to traditional exams, And this was, of course, in response to the pandemic. And also, there seems to be a clear move to make remote exams the default option by the end of this year, with all tests conducted online. Some of the debates have to do with, of course, academic student integrity, about authenticity, and in an interesting report, we have all the references from which we drew in relation to our research in the end of the slides, some of the key references anyway, so we'll be able to share them with you. Some of the debates have described coronavirus pandemic as a perfect storm for contract cheating, but there are some views that say, on balance, the pandemic's influence on integrity may be more positive than negative. Some academic integrity experts claim that online assessment will reduce the incidence of cheating and plagiarism, academic offenses among students, while others praise some of the key technology tools like invigilation technology, proctoring system. Assessment offenses, as we realize, are a very complex problem, both in traditional exams, and of course, it continues to be complex in online settings. Now, coming to our context, what we will talk about. For the University of London, the COVID-19 pandemic made fixed time and written examinations centers across the globe impossible. At very short notice, summative assessment was moved online for approximately 30,000 students. We are talking about a significant number of students. The University of London has commissioned a project, this particular project we'll be reporting on, to explore the experience of the students of this change to online assessment. I need to mention that the assessment repertoire at the University of London, if I can use this expression, is not exclusively focused on exams, online or paper-based. Coursework assessment is widely used at the University of London, but this particular study we are concentrating on, we are talking about today, is focused on unseen examinations. We'll come back to that with my colleagues, but in reality, we had a wide range of exam formats. But for the purposes of this research, we categorized them into three types, which considered the submission type that students had: short, up to 5 hours; medium, between 5 and 48 hours; and long submission. This window, long submission window, was 7 hours. And over to Linda.
Yes, so it was a big job moving all those exams online, and what we wanted to do was make sure we did a thorough review of that experience. So we've looked at, in this project, 4 key areas. So student behaviours. We needed to understand how students interacted with our virtual learning environments, with the proctoring system that some students had, the ways in which they submitted their answers, and the global exam take-up. Did we provide an opportunity for students to be assessed this summer, knowing how important it was for their progression and for those who were graduating in relation to jobs and so on. We also looked at student sentiment. So we issued a survey that went out 2 weeks after a programme's assessment had finished, and the last of the surveys were completed at the end of August. So students were completing this before their marks were confirmed. We followed up with some interviews, and we have a group of students, CDE, student research fellows, working with the research team on this, which is good. We're also looking at student outcomes. So basically, have the average marks and the average pass rates and the distribution of awards differed significantly this year in comparison to 3 previous years? So have students done better or worse? And Stylianos introduced us to some of the research ideas there around online assessment. And then finally, and very importantly, we are looking at operational logistical issues, the experience of programme and marking teams, the experience of colleagues working in the centre, understanding what those assessment choices have been. We've been able to make sure that we are gathering feedback and information from students across gender and age distributions and across location. So what we're going to drill into now is the details around the survey that we've picked up from students. So we sent the survey out, and we're now going to have a look at that. On the next slide, I'm going to show you some of the outcomes. So we had a, sorry, I'm handing over to Alan now. I beg your pardon, Alan. You're taking over on this one, if you're happy to.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Linda, and hello to everybody. So this slide deals with the demographics, in particular, of our investigation. And just to run over some of the key issues, which you can probably pick out yourselves. So we have a total population of 30,000 students, and we sent our survey out to students around 2 weeks after their completion of the online assessment. We closed that survey at the end of August, and we got 8,595 responses, which is, importantly, a response rate of 29.5%, which we think is quite good in this kind of sector of survey work. And we were supported in the analysis of that survey by partners Shift Insights, who I must say we found very good to work with indeed. The survey consisted mostly of Likert type questions, whether people like things a lot, a little, or not at all, and complemented by open text opportunities. So there's thematic analysis of a lot of the open text comments, and that's critical to developing our understanding of this new form of assessment. And we're presently at work with interviews with a small number of students, and we hope to report finally in November this year. We're also conducting interviews with some program directors and with some examiners. And we're going to use the findings from these in conjunction with student performance and behaviour data, as well as operational considerations, to determine future assessment strategies. So we won't be determining the future assessment strategies. Our work is in part a report to the senior management of the University of London, who have important decisions to make this year, really, for next year's modes of assessment, as well as producing academic work, which we hope will be of interest to the field. So you can see here in this slide a good representation of response demographics that broadly fit with our overall student body. This is in particular with regard to student age, gender, balance between undergraduate and postgraduate students, independent students, and those who attend a local teaching centre. So that's an interesting distinction. So 48% of students surveyed study entirely independently, whereas just over half are supported in a teaching centre, which is a form of blended learning. These responses also show the exam formats of short, medium, and long submission times, but a very small cohort of students had a long submission exam period of 7 days. Now, postgraduate numbers are particularly low because many postgrad programs were not assessed in this round 2020 this summer. So this slide concerns impact on students. And so we normally, or in previous years, we've had around 600 local exam centres, but we had an 8% higher exam take-up rate with the online mode, and students in all geographic locations were able to engage with the examinations. That's despite the challenges in some countries of infrastructure, download, reliable broadband, etc. We were particularly glad to see high levels of agreement with students who confirmed that they could demonstrate their learning in the online mode. The biggest barriers for the 7% who did not sit their exams included not having time to study due to COVID-19, 40%, so COVID impacting on them and their families, as well as not feeling academically prepared, some 32%. Importantly, 29% suggested the impact of COVID on their mental health was a barrier to assessment participation. And indeed, in my own small number of student interviews. I've heard that directly from one or two students. So results relating to their experience of assessment indicate that many felt stressed during the process. But issues related to access, such as equipment and broadband, were much less common for those who did not enter the exams. And a small geographical insert on the bottom right is a snapshot of student activity on one of our virtual learning platforms. This was for an exam format that allows students 24 hours for submission. For very large cohorts, we see peaks of activity on the VLE at the point the exam opens across those 3 days. You can see those three high points there very clearly. And on the first couple of occasions, this is an operational point of interest, this caused the VLE to crash for a short time. The exam submission pattern for this group of students varied. We've identified that we need to help students to understand how they make best use of the time available for their exam. And other ways in which students will benefit include training and practice in relation to using text matching software for open book and open world exam format. And so this very positive headline is one that we're taking with us and will be taking with us in our report to the University of London Senior Management, that a majority of students indicated a positive experience with online assessment. And so our virtual learning environment, which is a Moodle one, was examined by us. And what we see here is a generally positive support for students' preparation to use the platform. Uploading their answers went well, and they had a suitable environment to undertake the exam. So all of these things were things that we didn't know before students did this online examination process. Uploading their completed responses was successful at a level of 88%. Although interestingly, students who handwrote their assessment were more likely to agree with this at 92%, than those who typed it, 87%. Also importantly, women were less likely to agree that they were able to demonstrate their learning at 77%, and that they felt prepared at 67%, with men who were 81% and 73% for the same question. Our teams of examiners who normally have received paper-based scripts also had to move online, and the University of London had some logistical challenges in managing large numbers of files. Students could upload their written answers page by page and scanned or photographed. And we explored the communications experience of students this summer. That's communications from the University of London. And while globally more than 70% of students felt communications were good, which is a positive outcome, there was certainly room for improvement in our speed of response and in the clarity of some information. And this is not surprising given how quickly the University of London and the programme teams had to move to put this huge online assessment event into place. But it's very helpful in planning ahead, which is what this whole exercise is intended to support. So if we move to the next slide, I will hand back to Stylianos.
Okay, thank you, Alan. Of course, an important question there, which concerns the higher education sector, but also the University of London as well, is the future. So an important aspect of the survey was to ask the students about their preferences in relation to what will happen in the future. So the survey, I need to say that was carried out after students had taken the online assessment, but before they received the results. And we took the opportunity to ask this a question, the question you see on your screens at the moment, about students' preferred mode of assessment in the future. So what was the outcome of that? Very important, because it can drive the strategy, the assessment strategy, the learning and teaching strategies of institutions. And of course, the University of London is very much interested in that as well. Given the option of different assessment approaches, just over half of the respondents, 51%, would prefer to sit an online assessment at home using their own device, which was very interesting for us to see. And another important part of the population was students requiring special access arrangements. And the university needed to accommodate 100% the needs of the students. So these students were significantly likely to choose online assessment taken at home using a device. And this percentage was about 62%, quite significant again. 23% said their preference was the familiar, unseen, written exam taken at an examination center, like before. And this exam is written by hand. So, looking at the sample, overall, the majority of students from all regions appear to prefer an online assessment at home. However, those from regions with poorer digital readiness were significantly less likely to choose this option compared to those more prepared. There's a new concept to introduce here, which is the concept of digital readiness, which has to do with the ease with which a particular country, for instance, including organizations and institutions there, can transition to a digitized workflow and operations. Over to Linda.
Okay, so what we've tried to do here is to give you a snapshot of what is really quite a large study, and we will publish our results later on in the year, we hope. So we've picked out there, I think, some of the important aspects, which is that overall this was actually a successful experience. 93% of our students did engage with exams. Of those who didn't engage, the majority were experiencing COVID-related issues to engagement rather than technology or online. And while it's incredibly important to understand those mental health and health issues, those were things that were outside our sphere of control. We've also seen that students overall were successful in engaging with the virtual learning environments and being able to upload their answers, and marking is just finishing, and students will have had their results. There have been some operational issues, of course, with anything taken on such large scale, and there's lots to be learned here, I think. One of the analyses that will continue in this is to really dig more deeply into the format of exams and the implications of the different types of format, which we haven't got time to talk about this morning, but I hope will be picked up in some of the other discussions. So what we've seen then from the slide that Stylianos just presented is that 66% of the students would like online assessment to continue into the future. But what we know is that there are implications that we need to consider in relation to invigilation and proctoring, to digital competencies and infrastructure, our own infrastructure, as well as the infrastructure available to our students to allow them to engage in online assessment. Format of assessment and exams, you know, the borderline between assessments, open book, coursework, examination types are all important, I think, to think about there. As are the opportunities and the issues presented by assessment offence opportunities. So institutional support to address the issue of perception of the value of online assessment is going to be important too. If we think about regulators within different countries or professional body regulators, we have to understand their perspectives in online assessment as well as our own. And enhancements to communication with students and opportunities to help students develop their skills appropriate to online assessment will be all part of our future. So we're going to stop there and open the floor up to questions, if we may, and I'll just pop the reference slides on there so you've got those. The slides will be available on the CDE website for everybody, along with the links to the videos, so you'll be able to pick these up in more detail.
Thank you very much. That was a great presentation, a great start of the event. So I've seen that there have been quite a lot of questions making your presentation, which probably can be summarized in two main area. One is about the notion of cheating and what do you do about cheating and how do you prevent cheating, and there are also some technical questions about the software that you have used. So I don't know if you want to, if you had a chance to have a look at what was happening in the meeting chat. There are quite a lot of questions. Or if you want to just to respond very generally about how do you deal with cheating? Some colleagues will say cheating is part of the student experience. So how do we deal with that, especially when it's happening online?
Okay, Benedetta, if I start, and I'm sure Alan and Stylianos will be able to contribute here. So first of all, I think it's important to recognise exactly what you said, that cheating, it has been part of the academic environment through history. We have seen some, collectively across the globe, we've seen some alternative ways and some approaches to assessment offences. But I think as we go into the next session that Chris Cobb is leading, there will be a discussion, I think, about authenticity of assessment there, which will be very, very interesting to feed into this. But what we've recognised is that the role of invigilation may be very important for particular types of exams and particular circumstances. So the issues that we face globally are around effective proctoring for students who are working on assessment within an environment that's not controlled. So that's one of the areas. But we also recognise that there are tremendous opportunities to adjust the type of exam and the expectations of the output from students in order to facilitate more authentic assessment. So we're definitely in discussion, and colleagues across the University of London Federation are working very well in this. And of course, the other strand of this conference is looking at designing an assessment, and in part that is related to opportunities for authentic assessment. Alan and Stylianos, did you want to add to that?
I would like to add something, but to Linda's very comprehensive answer. And yeah, there seems to be two particular approaches to dealing with academic integrity or lack of academic integrity as far as how students are concerned. And yes, true, the first necessary infrastructure has to do with technologies like invigilation technologies or proctoring. Also, very correctly, Linda has identified an important aspect there, which sometimes in assessment boards is the elephant in the room, and this is redesigning our assessment, which is a big strand of this particular conference. I will give you an example. For instance, in this particular context of the University of London, there were open book exams with a longer submission time, which gave the opportunity to students to be creative and without having any temptation to go down the route of academic offences. So there are approaches to design and assessment that are very important there, that can deal with this type of academic offences. Project-based exams, open book exams, exams that have to do with students showing skills beyond memorizing the contents of a particular book to use in the exams.
Thank you. So we now have 5 more minutes for questions. So I would like to ask colleagues that if they have a question, they can just raise their hand and go ahead. Anybody? Oh, yes, there is Chris Little. Yeah, Chris.
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yes.
Firstly, thank you so much for that presentation. It's absolutely fascinating, and it's really great to finally see some proper data on what students have made of all of this. I think it's really, really exciting what you've got there, and I really, really thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask the project team's kind of perspective, and I know this will go down like a lead balloon in the room, of why we're still bothering with exams. Because essentially, whether it's 5 hours, 2 days, a week, you're essentially asking them to write an essay or complete an MCQ. But when we know the research says that exams in their traditional format, I know you can find research to support pretty much anything, but the dominant research suggests that traditional exam structures aren't actually effective for learning, they're effective for recall, and they're two very different things. Why we don't just shift away from them, why we need to do all of this reconceptualization of what an online exam looks like when we've got softwares like Turnitin, etc., that will support assignment work.
Absolutely. I think you've raised a really important point, and I do hope that this pivot does have an impact in the longer term. But we also have to recognise that, well, certainly for the University of London, we're working in 190 countries, and we're working with regulators who have to give recognition to our degrees within those contexts. And there are many places where online assessment is not considered to be as robust as unseen written exams in an examination centre. And then coursework is also not considered to be part of the gold standard of assessment. And we also work with professional body regulators, the Law Society, etc. So we're caught in the middle of that discussion, and I think that this is a very fertile time for more discussion around that, absolutely, and opportunities for development.
I wonder if with that, just following on from that,
very briefly.
Yeah, very briefly, completely get your points. But I wonder if we are in danger of, when we allow exams to come back as they were, because that is what will happen in a lot of institutions, just reinforcing a dominant mode of education that has been outdated for a long time, because the people who decide that that's what we do went through it. Much in the same way that we all lecture and use slides and things like that, we recreate what we experienced. And that is often seen as the gold standard. It's just a thought, sorry. I'll let you move on now, but thank you very much. I do really appreciate it.
I'm really sorry. I don't.
May I reply just very briefly?
Yeah.
Just to say, I think, Chris, your points are well made, and I think this COVID crisis will, as crises in many sectors, accelerate change. So it may not get to where you want to, but I think it is going to open up questions about what end of course, end of module, end of program assessment is for, and how it can best be managed in ways that haven't been done before. Thanks, Benedict.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it's great to see how many people have put in their thoughts in the meeting chat. I know that there is a question for Russell Square College in Mumbai. Unfortunately, we don't have time now. If you can hold your question, maybe if we have time at the end, we can have that after the second presentation. So I would like to welcome the second speakers. So we will have Chris, Craig and Marianne. Hi Chris, I can see you on the screen. That are going to talk assessment rebooted. Again, you have 25 minutes and then 10 minutes for question. So the stage is yours.
Can I start by just echoing some of the reflections that have already been made? Linda's analogy of the toothpaste and the tube earlier, I thought was absolutely spot on. We cannot push this back in the toothpaste tube. Another one is sort of the stable gate has been opened and the horse is bolted. So I really don't think we can go back. But I'm also really sort of aware of Chris's reflection just then, that we're not really taking advantage of what digital assessment can offer, in the same way as I think with some of the virtual learning environment implementations, we're not really taking advantage of some of the ways in which you can teach digitally rather than just putting teaching materials online through a virtual learning environment. So I think there is a culture shift that we need to take, and the report that I'm about to describe kind of looks at this culture change. It was commissioned last year, way ahead of any notion of COVID happening, maybe prescient in its time, but I was asked to chair a national group that looked at digital assessment over a 10-year horizon. So what would digital assessment look like in 2030? We had no idea at the time that we were writing it that advances would need to be made much faster. And I think what I'm going to do now is treat this session in two parts. One is to look at that vision of what digital assessment might offer, but also then ask two colleagues, Craig O'Callaghan and Marion Rand Davis, to speak to their experiences on the ground. So the first part of this is around the vision, the 2030 vision. The group felt that digital assessment needed three things. It needed to be relevant, and we've used words like authenticity in two forms, but another way of looking at this is it needs to be to the circumstances. It needs to be adaptable in terms of the changes that are ahead, and it needs to flex with that. And it also needs to be trustworthy, and this comes into the other form of interpretation of the word authenticity. Are these assessments being done by the people we think they're being undertaken by? So let's go through each of those three things in order. Relevance. I think we've all seen the advantages of keyboard entry this year. Students are able to write in a much more fluid way using a keyboard rather than a pen. It's what they're used to in a day-to-day environment. It's what they're used to in their formative assessment during the year. And I can't remember the last time I wrote start to finish using a pen. From an examiner's perspective, just it's more decipherable. You can understand the text and it's easier to interpret. So that's at a very basic level about authenticity. It's relevant for the context of the world that people are living in, and everyone uses a keyboard. But you can take it a lot further than that. With digital assessment, we can look at the ways in which people work. A lot of people work collaboratively, they work in groups. And with digital assessment, you have the ability to assess in that way as well. And by 2030, the report anticipates that there will be artificial intelligence and bots that could sort of create a group working environment in an authentic way that is relevant to a group assessment, for example. It is also around the way in which the student sort of is appeals to the skill sets that they're developing, that it's more accessible to them in terms of maybe their abilities or disabilities, and digital assessment is a means to overcome that. I think that everyone saw the advantage for disabled students moving straight over to digital, and some of the tools that disabled students had previously been using are now sort of more widely used by others. Moving on to adaptable, and why the sort of digital assessment needs to be or can make things more adaptable and more flexible. We could have something that's much more student-centered. So something that is around prior learning or personal ability, something that's actually assessing someone when they're ready to be assessed, rather than when we're wishing to do assessment. The concept of anytime, anywhere assessment. And digital assessment offers that opportunity with question banks and other ways. And taking into account prior learning and also what their learning outcomes and objectives are, assessing that's tuned to that environment rather than considering a one-size-fits-all. I think it's also got to be adaptable because of the size of digital assessment going forward. In a moment, we'll hear about the scaling of proctoring and how challenging that's been this academic year. Imagine that when we have a growing population around the world, and we've got to assess at scale. So what role might artificial intelligence have in doing a first or a second cut assessment examining process? So it can sort of look at the sort of a means by standardizing the assessment process and keeping some sort of validity to how papers are being marked. The last one is about the trustworthiness, and we've been hearing the word authenticity in an academic sense earlier, and this is where this comes into play, and the how digital assessment might be open to greater plagiarism and greater attacks. But I think it also has the answers to that as well. And ultimately, digital assessment only really needs to be as good as the current system, which is not infallible. So I think we need to look at this, in the context of what cheating takes place and what plagiarism takes place already. But digital assessment does offer solutions. It does offer, in the future, the ability to verify someone's identity in very many different ways. It offers the ability to look at past work to see whether the work being submitted and used is consistent with past work. This is not just checking it against Turnitin, but it's looking at the student's prior submissions. And it's also around the authenticity with regards to the data ownership with regards to submissions. So and that's a very brief overview of like a 10-year horizon, and I completely agree with Chris that I don't think anyone's going to push the toothpaste back in the tube. We've got to actually use this toothpaste. I'm going to probably stretch its metaphor way too far, in ways in which we think it can be used in the future. There's an opportunity here to grasp things and take digital assessment into places that are not just replacing what's gone before, but actually enhancing what's gone before. Now, with that, I'm going to sort of hand over now to, I think, Marianne to start off with, to describe what e-assessment's been like at Brunel University, where they've been using a product called WiseFlow, and where Brunel actually were using digital assessment previously, prior to the COVID outbreak.
Okay, thank you, Chris. I will try and share my slides. Can you see that at all?
Not yet.
Not yet. Now?
No.
Ooh. Okay, let me just exit and...
Marianne, I could share them for you. It's Linda here. I could share them for you if you like, because you kindly sent them to me yesterday.
Yeah, okay, let's try that.
Shall I go for that? Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably the easiest.
Are they coming up on screen yet?
Yeah, they're there, Linda.
Oh,
Yeah.
brilliant. Great,
Yeah.
thank you very much, and hopefully everybody can hear me. So good morning, and I'm really pleased to be able to tell you about how we at Brunel have been transitioning to digital assessments since 2016, when we first allowed our students to bring their own device. Now, until this summer, all those exams were conducted as invigilated on-campus exams using a lockdown browser. So although we were in a fairly good place, by no means we were doing these exams across the board. And when I looked at the numbers as we were getting ready for the spring exams, I realized that actually only 20% of our students had experienced digital exam. So just like everybody else, we faced some challenges this spring. If I could have the next slide, please. But what we did have was an assessment platform that both staff and students were familiar with. And we are using WiseFlow for both coursework and assessments. And you can see here the timeline of how we've implemented WiseFlow. So we started with back in 2016 with a proof of principle with a few bits of coursework and one exam, then scaled it up to one department, computer science, before deciding as an institution that we wanted to go ahead and roll this out. And you can see here over the last 3 years, we have been sort of going almost a college by college. So we've got 3 colleges at Brunel. So we are now at full speed, as it were. Now, you can see along the top the submissions we've had, and obviously increasing as rollout has progressed. Most of those submissions will coursework, but of course this year we have also had all of our exams digitally. Now, one point to perhaps make is that the scripts or the submissions that are made can then be accessed by the markers and digitally marked, as well as accessed by external examiners and other internal moderators. So that was the sort of background. So if I could have the next slide, please. Nothing has changed yet, but hopefully it will. We didn't have much time to get ready for our exams. We went into lockdown around the 20th of March, 5 weeks until the first exam in April, and with Easter in the middle. So we made the decisions that we would defer the master level, so level 7 exams, until August, and that explains the larger number of exams during that period. All of the exams were open book, and we didn't use the lockdown browser because we knew from experience that we really had to almost give the opportunity for students to have their laptops health checked to make sure that the operating system was up to date. There was no pirated software on their computer, or making sure that the lockdown browser would have downloaded properly and so on. So they were purely open book and no lockdown. We did, however, time limit them in most cases. So exam length for the majority of exams were not much longer than they would have been anyway, with some additional upload time. So we used time pressure for our students. Now, one of the things we were quite concerned about was how we would support our students, because the majority of them had never experienced it. And I did receive an awful lot of emails from anxious students saying, were we really sure that we shouldn't just cancel all the exams? That would be far better than making them try and take them at home. So we decided to embed a chat tool within WiseFlow, and that was absolutely the right thing to do. So over the 3 weeks of the exam period in April, May, we had about 1,200 queries through this chat tool. 600 of them were in the first 3 days of that 3-week period. So there definitely is a sort of familiarity that is required in order to run exams remotely and perhaps digitally also for students, to make them feel comfortable. Could I have the next slide, please? So in WiseFlow, we of course have a digital footprint, and that has allowed us to look at how different groups of students engaged with the exams. So we went out and basically gave our students the option, or whether they wanted to take the exams in April, May, or defer it to August. Now, most students, around 80% of students, decided to sit them in spring. And what we then did was to make sure that, okay, was there anybody who were perhaps unintentionally disadvantaged by doing remote and digital exams? So we looked here by various characteristics, and these are the ones that you would normally regard as being disadvantaged, but also they represent, I think, the communities that were most impacted by COVID. And you can see here that Black students, those with low household income, from most disadvantaged areas, and also disabled students, were less likely to engage with their exams. Of course, the reasons will be complicated. If I can have the next slide, please. We've already touched on the sort of validity of remote and open book exams, and I thought I would show you here the outcome for the university. There are still a few outstanding assessments results to come in, but it looks like we have got a 4 to 5% increase in the proportion of students who were awarded a first or an upper second class degree. I don't have any benchmark, so I have no idea whether this is a reasonable outcome or not. But if you can advance the slide, please, I will show you there at the bottom some of the tactics we tried to use, either singly or in combination, to be able to make the exams as valid and in terms of differentiating students as possible. So encouraging staff to really look at the questions that they were intending to be sat under control condition, making sure that they included higher order thinking and so on, to make it more difficult to just Google the answers, or impossible to just Google the answers. We did have some MCQs, which I was very skeptical about whether it would be possible to do, but by randomizing both the questions and the answers, which essentially meant that every student would have a different exam, slightly different exam paper, that actually works extremely well. Already talked a little bit about adding time pressure, so not using so long or so much, giving them so much time that those who didn't know the answers could just research and find them all. We did adjust our marking criteria and the expectations of what students should be able to demonstrate, given that they had access to all the resources that they could. And finally, this is sort of post-exam, is for the exam panels and boards to really scrutinise the outcomes and look at the assessments very carefully to see whether they had a similar profile in outcomes to previous years. So, my last slide, please. What about the future? Well, I prefer to talking about the genie out of the bottle rather than toothpaste coming out of a tube, but whatever analogy you prefer, I think there is no doubt in my mind that the experiences this year is a catalyst for reimagining assessment. And at Brunel, we have some departments who are saying they will not go back to the past. And we are accelerating discussions about really what the purpose of assessment is. And I think that comes back to Chris Little's comment earlier. What does authentic assessment look like? You know, what is it that we want to assess and how do we best do it? And can careful design actually reduce collusion and even contract cheating? And we had already started with this in the sort of last year, experimenting with exams that actually put technology at their heart. And so, for example, we gave students in computer science the task of designing a game and giving them access to coding software, to Word, PowerPoint, Excel, other resources that we whitelisted. So those were they had access to the resources we gave them access to. And that worked extremely well. Now, clearly it's high risk, because if the technology goes down, you can't then just revert to pen and paper. Can you just advance the slide, please? And my last little thing comes up. It's just the final point I want to make is that the technology should be the enabler, not the driver. And we need to make sure that we retain a focus on pedagogy as we consider the art of the possible and embrace the possibilities that technology brings to us and allow us to assess in hopefully more appropriate and meaningful way. And the report that Chris talked about earlier really highlights what we should perhaps all be aiming for. Thank you.
We can't hear you, Chris. We can't hear you, Chris. Yeah.
Is that better?
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks, Marianne. And now I'm going to turn to my colleague, Craig O'Callaghan, who's going to describe how the University of London used the Janison product to take examinations online, part of which you've been experiencing yourselves, and it's been conversation earlier today. But Craig, over to you.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, colleagues. I'll give you a bit of context really to understand the challenge that we faced. The University of London worldwide programme has students in about 190 countries, and we examine generally in about 160 plus countries globally. About 35,000 students, and very few of our large-scale examinations have any coursework at all. So the only way they can be assessed is through final written examination. And around about 80% of our students have no coursework at all in their assessment profile. So our ability to assess any student was wholly reliant on our ability to assess them in an examination context in the summer. So from that, we had about 2 months. What's probably taken Brunel 4 years, we had 2 months or 3 months to try and do this. We had 2 options, bluntly. COSEC, the University of London, had a relationship with Janison, one of the proprietary products, and we decided to potentially look at a pilot with them, but also to how we could use Moodle effectively. Now, with Janison, and it's one of the sort of big 3 or 4 companies. I'm not critical of Janison particularly. I think the challenge that Janison had was they'd never done anything at this scale in high stakes final examinations. They were a professional education company really, and I don't think were equipped to examine to the scale and volume that we were looking at. The challenges that we faced, I think, would broadly be threefold. The first came around this issue of proctoring. Now, the challenge really in that is that most of the big companies can do proctoring. There's no issue around they can do proctoring. It's their ability to proctor in countries with low bandwidth. And we have an awful lot of our students in countries like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, where bandwidth was a real issue. And what we found that students were able to use this technology to pre-enter the examination, give their biometric details, and that wasn't an issue. But when it came to sitting in examination, it became a huge issue. And around about 15%, 20% of our students had a really quite poor experience and were unable to take the examinations in Janison because frankly their bandwidth was not able to equip them to do the examination. So bluntly speaking, we had to abandon Janison. There's no way we could have a situation where some of our students were having a reasonably good experience and some were having a poor experience. And therefore we had to abandon Janison after 2 days of examinations and move wholly to a Moodle environment to do the exams. Now, that meant 2 things. That meant that none of our examinations were proctored at all. We were reliant on the question types and the way the exams were constructed to try and ensure that we minimised any potential of cheating as possible. All these examinations were done at home. None of them were done under exam conditions in a centre or on a lockdown browser in that sense. So, there was a degree of exposure on the basis of that. What we've found, essentially speaking, let's be honest, is that clearly the level of plagiarism that's been picked up through Turnitin has been quite high on the basis of that. We did certainly make students very aware in the information. They had to properly reference their material, reference their work. It had to be their own work. Penalties would be imposed if they weren't able to do so and demonstrate. So one of the challenges that we face, obviously, is post-exam board and post-results release is to deal with a much higher level of suspected examination irregularities with students. And that is an ongoing process I currently see here today. What went well from our perspective was that students were able to take examinations on Moodle without really any huge difficulties, shall we say. And, the 93% of people that took those examinations broadly had a reasonably good experience on Moodle. There were already obviously some issues, but generally speaking, that was good. And I think we were quite content with how that went. The big challenge with Moodle is at the other end of the scale, is how you mark. Some of our papers have over 5,000 students, and essentially the Moodle is not constructed to handle that level of scale at all. Just couldn't handle that level of scale. We had real difficulties in getting a Moodle instance to enable us to have examiners coming in and retrieving the scripts and marking as they saw fit. And that meant we had an awful lot of work on the edges of Moodle to try and improve it very quickly. We made some improvements, but it was still a far less satisfactory experience for examiners. They had a tough time, some of those, particularly on the large papers. Smaller papers, less than 500 students, a reasonable experience. The real strength of the Janison platform, Wiseflow, Inspira, is their marking functionality. It's really high quality. Examiners will have a great experience on that. And I think that is the challenge for any Moodle-based products, to start to look at the way they can improve their marking capabilities. It falls a long way short of what is available on the big platforms at the moment. But of course, the issue is around proctoring, and that is going to be the big challenge on a global basis. Certainly if you're in London, UK, in an examination hall, lockdown browser, that's fine. But when you're trying to examine people at home in areas with very low bandwidth because of COVID, that is a challenge beyond recognition, I think, for the companies at CFID at the moment. So that's a challenge we're going to face going forward. And it will then, I think, need us to think very carefully about the questions that have been raised earlier on about question types, how we assess students on that ongoing basis.
Sorry, you are running out of time. If you can just conclude, make it.
Yeah. Last thing I'll just say is that the key thing is obviously around student experience. That is going to be at the heart of our feedback on this basis. There are no easy solutions here for worldwide. We've learned an awful lot from this, and I'll pause there.
Thanks. I'm sorry, Craig, for my interruption, but there are lots of comment, and I want to give a little bit of space for colleagues to ask a question. So there was quite a lot of enthusiasm, and I could see in the chat that people were asking to have more of these discussions. In fact, they were asking for more spaces for exchanging ideas, which I found particularly interesting. If I can abuse of my position, I would like to ask a question to Marianne. I'm really interested in the slides that you put around disadvantaged students, and how probably what's happened over the summer made the disadvantaged students more in a disadvantaged position. And I'm wondering if your college, your university, is thinking a way forward.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Yes, it wasn't just out of interest we ran that data. It was also to help us look at what we would do for the August exam period. So one of the things we were concerned about was, and had some anecdotal evidence, was the students didn't have the right environments in which to sit their exams. So we opened up rooms at university for students to sit exams there if they wanted to. We even opened up accommodation if they wanted to come and stay overnight and so on. I have to say the take-up wasn't great, but some of these things, I think those who need it, it's really, really valuable, and it's not necessarily about the numbers. And the other thing we also did was, for the same reasons really, making sure that if they wanted to, because of low bandwidth at home perhaps, or poor internet connections, they could come onto campus, they would have access to a lone laptop. So we tried to facilitate it, and for our disabled students in particular, we actually reached out to all of them and said, okay, what were the reasons, is there anything that we can do? So we really tried to go the extra mile with it. And of course, it has now also been, we've used part of this information in how we are trying to keep an eye on these students as we are all doing our online teaching, not just assessment, but okay, that was just an indicator, I think, about how they are finding or might be finding engaging with with the online teaching a challenge.
Thank you. Thanks. I open now the stage for question. I see the Russell Square as a hand. They raised their hand for the last presentation, so I don't know if the question is still relevant, if you want to ask your question.
Ma'am, we were just concerned about the assessment, the grading which is done, where we are using Turnitin, where similarity rates are very high. So, where the students and ethical, how ethical it will be, like whether students will not practice, how they will, you know, how unethical it will be, like students will cheat and all that things. So how we are going to answer those issues?
Students are using the same reference material and the same subject guide. So a certain degree of similarity is bound to happen. So how's that been addressed? Even faculty prepare their presentations based on the subject guide and the links and share it with students. And many of the students pick up points from those PPTs. So those students are coming up with such high degrees of plagiarism that we are concerned, because it's not their fault, we feel, because they have access to the same material.
Okay, thank you. I think Linda has the, I don't know, Linda, if you want to answer that question.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think you're raising some specific issues about your particular group of students, but in this forum, I think the takeaways are really the issues of that question of use of Turnitin or text matching software, and the importance of training our students and colleagues in using that. And certainly, as Craig mentioned, within the couple of months we had to set the system up this summer, we didn't have that opportunity to prepare students for a situation where their work might be put through text matching software. So I think it is important that we take that as a takeaway within the University of London, but I suspect it's relevant across the sector, and it's very much about the training and preparation going alongside the design of the assessment, and I think that the presentation we've just had really helps us to identify those slides at the end, Marianne, were very, very, very pertinent for all of us to think about what is the purpose of assessment, and what do we want to do with that, and what does it mean for our students. So it's some very important work here, and I'm so pleased there's so much engagement with the group of colleagues on this call. It's very exciting. So much to learn, I feel.
Yeah, there is another person who raised their hand, PLE Loic.
Yeah, that's Loic. Thank you. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for your presentations. That was very, very interesting. We've been working with WiseFlow in my school for, well, because of this lockdown and because of all these issues. And, well, all the things that we have discussed there are very interesting, but I would like to have some information about some maybe more practical things in terms of organization. How does it work, or how did it work at Brunel University of London in terms of administrative support? I mean, who was in charge of organizing the exams, of putting everything within the system, within the WiseFlow system? Was it the professors? Did they get some support? What kind of IT support did the students as well? These are many issues that we have been confronted to, and I guess that we are not the only ones, and that would be very interesting to get some information about that as well.
Okay, I will do my best. So because we've been doing it for such a few years, well, such a long time, or 4 years, so we have switched, if that's the right word, some of the work of our administrators, who in the past would have been helping to prepare the exam questions, the papers, getting them, you know, copied up and what have you, laid out properly. So those administrators are now putting the exam papers, the questions, into WiseFlow. But we also have a central exam service which would normally be in charge of, you know, preparing the big exam halls and setting out the tables and doing all those kind of logistical things. So they are now supporting the digital exams. And in terms of support, I say we had, in addition to the chat tool, also telephone and email sort of links that sources that the students could access. We wanted them to do that because that would be more instant, and we were then able to provide them with advice. For example, if you get to the end, at the beginning of an exams, you would see lots of activity, and then it would go fairly quiet. And when it came to submission, and that's when the students realized that, oh my goodness, their internet had gone down or whatever, and panic, what do they do? At which point they would be contacting us, and there would be somebody helping them, or what to do in those circumstances. And I think in terms of students, I just quickly saw a thing in the chat, which was whether we had evaluated the experience of students. We've actually really struggled at Brunel to engage our students in evaluation, because they have just adapted right from the beginning, really so well to using the laptops. It's like, what's the big deal? I mean, I am more nervous every exam period than they are. But what I can say is that we have had some good feedback, particularly around the chat. And I did say in my presentation that I had lots of emails from students before the exam period saying, they were really not comfortable. Absolutely nothing has come through afterwards. And generally, students will let us know, no doubt about it, if they had issues. And this has gone, I think, much, much better than perhaps they themselves expected. So from the student point of view, I don't think we have any problems.
Thank you. There were a comment on the chat also in terms of, again, and this is a recurrent issue, how to design the rubric, how do you make questions, but there is one point that I found very, very interesting, and Chris mentioned that at the beginning, this idea that we can be more flexible in terms of time. Sometimes students are cheating because they are pressure for time. What about having more flexibility and allow students to take examinations not just once or twice a year, but more than twice a year? So probably that will reduce the pressure, because they will submit their work when they are ready to do so. So that was an interesting take, Chris, that I haven't thought about it.
Yeah, I think all options. I think we need to start with a blank sheet of paper rather than looking at what we're doing now. And be inventive about how we do assess authentically, and make it more student focused. And that's one way of making it way more student focused, is to look at when the student's ready for the examination rather than when we want to examine.
Yeah. Craig, do you want to add something?
I agree. The real challenge, obviously, for worldwide is we don't have any academics. We rely on academics from all the member institutions to mark. So we're at their behest when they can mark, and therefore that is why they structure them in such a way, because that's when they can do the work. They've got their full-time academics, their own institutions. They have no ability to do it outside of those timelines, and that's why it's very much more difficult for worldwide to have more than one period of exams a year, because there's no academics to mark the work. They're doing their own internal work in those colleges, and their research active academics. So there are some challenges for us outside of the normal thing we can do, and that's why the notion of relying on final examinations is seen as a way to scale our ability to get examiners to mark, rather than continue throughout the year when they frankly have got other things to do.
Yeah, definitely, and I can really rely on that, Craig.
You can see that, Bernadette. Yeah.
Yes. So if anybody want to say just a very last few words, we are just finished on time, which is very good for the first session. So is anybody want to last comment or question? If not, well, I have to say it has been great, great start of the day, very informative, and lots of thinking in terms of strategically, operationally, but also we have to remind ourselves the ethics behind our job and the pastoral care for students. And just a final thought that the sector is being criticized quite a lot at the moment, but we have worked incredibly hard over the summer, all of us. Few of us, in fact, have taken annual leave, and so I think we should just say well done us that we are surviving to this. And I know that probably the best is yet to come, but well, let's have a coffee break and see each other again in 15 minutes. Okay, bye-bye.